The great hall of Voss Castle had gone silent, and that silence was worse than any shout. Elira Hastings stood at the center of the stone floor, in a gown of pale silver, her hands folded in front of her, while 300 wolves in human form watched her the way hunters watch something wounded. The fires along the walls cracked and hissed. Somewhere above, in the high timber rafters, a raven shifted its feet and watched too, as if it understood exactly what was about to happen. Alpha King Draven Voss stood a few feet away from her, still in his ceremonial coat, the wedding rings not yet cool on their fingers. He had not touched her once, since the priestess pronounced them bound. He had not looked at her, not truly, not since she had walked down the aisle between rows of wolves, who did not want her there. Now he looked at her, and what was in his eyes was not affection. "I did not choose this," Draven said, his voice carrying easily across the hall, the way a king's voice is trained to carry. "The treaty chose this. My father's blood chose this. I want every wolf in this room to understand that I did not kneel for a human bride. I was made to kneel." A murmur ran through the crowd, something between agreement and hunger, like wolves scenting a wound before it bleeds. Elira did not move. She kept her chin level, her shoulders back, though her heart was slamming so hard she was certain the nearest rose could hear it. She had known this marriage would be difficult. She had not expected to be humiliated in front of the entire northern court before the first night was even over. "Look at her," Draven went on, gesturing toward her with an open hand, the same hand that had placed a ring on her finger not 20 minutes earlier. No claws, no fangs, no sense for the moon. A treaty bride, weak as parchment, given to me because human kings grew tired of losing their sons to our borders. This is what ends a war. Not a warrior, not a wolf. A girl who cannot even run fast enough to keep pace with a pup. Laughter rippled through pockets of the crowd. Not everyone laughed. Some watched Elira's face with something closer to pity, quickly hidden, because pity was dangerous to show in that hall. Elira felt heat rise in her throat, but she did not let it reach her eyes. She had learned long ago, in a small village on the human side of the border, that tears handed to a cruel audience only fed the cruelty. So she stood, and she let the words hit her, and she did not flinch. "She is a consolation prize," Draven said, quieter now, almost to himself, though the hall was so silent that even his half-spoken words reached every corner. "A crown I did not ask to marry, wrapped in human skin. I hope none of you believe for a moment that I chose weakness." It was the word weakness that finally made something in Elira's chest go very still and very cold, not with sorrow, but with a strange, sharpened calm. She lifted her eyes, and, for the first time since entering the hall, met the king's gaze directly. "You may say what you like about the treaty, my lord," she said. Her voice was steady, low, but it cut through the murmuring crowd with surprising clarity. "You may say what you like about my blood, or my speed, or my claws that do not exist. But you stood beside me, and made a vow in front of your court and your gods, and if you meant none of it, then the weakness in this hall does not belong to me." The hall did not laugh this time. For a heartbeat, something flickered across Draven's face, something that might have been surprise, quickly buried beneath irritation. No one spoke to the Alpha King that way. No one human had ever dared. "Careful," he said softly, and there was a warning under the word, an old wolf instinct rising just beneath his skin. "You are a guest in my house, bride or not." "I am your wife," Elira answered, whether either of us wanted that word or not. A low growl rolled through the crowd, not from Draven, but from somewhere near the front, from his cousin Cale Voss, who stood with his arms crossed and a smile that did not reach his eyes. Cale had never wanted this treaty either, though for reasons far less honorable than heartbreak. "She has a mouth on her," Cale said, loud enough to be heard, drawing another ripple of laughter. Perhaps the humans thought a mouth was worth more than teeth. Elira did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Draven, waiting, because some small, stubborn part of her still believed the king in front of her might remember he was a king, and not just a wounded animal lashing out at the nearest available target. He did not. "Take her to the servants' wing," Draven said, turning away from her as though the matter were already settled, already boring. "She is a bride in name only. She will live as one." 2 guards stepped forward, their faces carefully blank. The way faces become blank when their master says something even they find shameful. One of them, a young wolf with pale hair and kind eyes, hesitated just long enough to offer Illyra the smallest apologetic glance, before gesturing toward the side door. Illyra did not wait to be pulled. She walked on her own, spine straight, chin high, through a hall full of wolves, who watched her leave, the way they might watch prey, escape a trap it should not have escaped. She did not run. She did not hurry. She let every step be hers. It was only once the heavy oak door closed behind her, once the sound of the court's murmuring faded into stone and distance, that her hands began to shake. She pressed them flat against the cold wall of the corridor and breathed. The young guard lingered a moment longer than he needed to. "My lady," he said quietly, glancing back toward the hall, as though afraid someone might hear him use the title. "I am sorry for what happened in there." "Don't be," Illyra said, straightening. "It changes nothing you can control." He studied her for a moment, something thoughtful crossing his face, before he nodded and led her deeper into the castle, down a narrower stair, past doors that grew plainer and plainer, until they reached a small chamber near the kitchens, with a single shuttered window, and a bed too narrow to belong to any queen. "This is yours," he said. "I am sorry it isn't more." "It's enough," Illyra said, and meant it, because she had learned in her 22 years that a room was only ever as small as the fear inside it, and she refused to let fear live in hers. The guard left her there. She heard his footsteps fade, heard a lock turn somewhere far off, heard the castle settle into its nighttime creaks and groans the way old stone buildings do, as if breathing. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and finally allowed herself one slow, shuddering breath, the only one she would permit herself that night. She thought of her mother, Grace, who had raised her in a cottage on the border of wolf and human land, a place where the forest pressed close against the fields, and no one asked too many questions about the baby found wrapped in furs at the edge of the tree line, 18 years before Illyra was old enough to wonder about it herself. She thought of her father, Lucas, who used to tell her that the wild things of the forest never frightened him half as much as the cruelty of ordinary men. She wondered, sitting in a stone room in a castle full of wolves who despised her, whether he had been wrong about that. A sound outside the shuttered window pulled her from her thoughts, a low, uncertain whine, like an animal in distress. Illyra crossed the room and eased the shutter open, despite every instinct telling her it was foolish to go looking for trouble on her first night in a den of wolves, who already resented her. Below, in the moonlit courtyard, a young wolf pup, barely more than a cub, had gotten itself tangled in a coil of rope near the stables, thrashing and yelping, too panicked to free itself. No one else seemed to hear it. The courtyard was empty, the guards stationed elsewhere, the castle's attention still consumed by the spectacle in the great hall. Illyra did not think. She simply acted, the way she always had, slipping out through the servants' passage the guard had shown her, crossing the dark courtyard barefoot over cold stone, and kneeling beside the frightened pup. "Easy," she murmured, her hands moving carefully, gently, toward the tangled rope. "Easy now, I have you." The pup, wild-eyed and terrified only a moment before, went suddenly, strangely still. Its frantic thrashing stopped. Its ears, pinned flat against its skull, slowly rose. It looked up at Illyra with dark, liquid eyes, and something in its small body seemed to simply let go of fear entirely, as though her voice alone had reached past its panic and touched something calmer underneath. Illyra worked the rope loose with steady fingers, murmuring softly the whole while, and within a minute the pup was free, shaking itself off, sniffing at her hands with open curiosity rather than fear. "There," she said, smiling despite everything the night had already cost her. "Go on. Find your mother." The pup did not immediately run. It pressed its small head against her palm, once, almost reverently, before darting off into the shadows of the stable. Illyra stood slowly, brushing dust from her gown, and it was only then that she realized she was not alone in the courtyard. An old woman stood near the stable entrance, wrapped in a heavy shawl despite the mild night, her white hair loose around a face lined with more years than Illyra could easily guess. She had not made a sound approaching. She simply stood there, watching, her pale eyes fixed on Illyra with an intensity that made the younger woman's skin prickle. "That pup," the old woman said, her voice rough as old rope, "has bitten 3 grown wolves this month alone. Snapped clean through a guard's glove yesterday. He does not calm for anyone. Illyra did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The old woman took a slow step closer, tilting her head, studying Illyra, the way one studies something rare and half-remembered, a word on the tip of the tongue that refuses to surface. "What is your name, child?" she asked. "Illyra." "Illyra," the woman repeated softly, as if testing the shape of it. "And where were you born, Illyra?" "I don't know," Illyra admitted, because it was the truth, and truth felt like the only solid ground she had left that night. "I was found, as an infant, near the tree line." Something shifted in the old woman's expression, something quick and startled, gone almost before Illyra could name it. But her pale eyes did not leave Illyra's face, and for the first time since the wedding feast had begun, Illyra felt watched not with contempt, but with something closer to wonder. "Go inside, child," the old woman said finally, pulling her shawl tighter, already turning to leave. "The night air in this place is colder than it looks, and the things that walk in it are not always as harmless as one frightened pup." "Wait," Illyra called softly. "Who are you?" The old woman paused at the shadow's edge, glancing back over her shoulder. "Some call me Mother Yara," she said. "I have lived in this castle longer than any king who has ruled it, and I have not felt what I felt just now, watching you, in a very long time." Before Illyra could ask what that meant, the old woman was gone, swallowed by the dark between the stable and the wall, leaving Illyra alone in the courtyard, with nothing but the cold stone beneath her feet, and a strange, unshaped feeling stirring somewhere deep inside her, like a door she had never known existed, creaking open by a single inch. She returned to her narrow room, locked the shutter, and lay awake long after the castle had gone quiet, turning over every insult from the great hall, alongside that one, unexplainable moment when a wild, biting pup had gone utterly calm beneath her hands, and an old woman had looked at her as though she recognized a face out of legend. She did not sleep well that first night in Voss Castle, but somewhere beneath the humiliation, beneath the ache of being called weak in front of 300 strangers, a small, stubborn ember of curiosity had caught, and it refused to go out. By morning, the castle was already speaking of her, though not in the way Draven had intended. The guards who had escorted her to the servants' wing whispered about the pup that would not stop following her scent along the corridor before dawn, pacing outside her door until a groundskeeper finally chased it back to the kennels. The kitchen staff whispered about the strange calm that seemed to settle over every dog and hound that crossed her path on her way to fetch water, animals that ordinarily barked and snapped at strangers falling silent and watchful instead, tails low, ears attentive, as if waiting for instruction. None of it reached Draven's ears that morning, consumed as he was with council business and the low, grinding guilt he refused to name, the guilt of having said the word weakness to a woman who had not once raised her voice against him in return, not truly, not with anything but honesty. He told himself it did not matter. He told himself a bride was a bride, a treaty was a treaty, and neither required warmth to function. He told himself many things that morning, standing at his window looking down at the courtyard where, if he had looked more carefully, he might have noticed the way even the castle's oldest, most short-tempered hound had begun following a slight, silver-gowned figure at a respectful distance, tail wagging low and slow, the way wolves greet something ancient and half-remembered in their blood. But Draven did not look carefully. Not yet. By midday, Illyra had been given a list of duties by a stern housekeeper named Ivy Marsh, a wolf-woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, who made it clear from the first sentence that she considered the new arrangement an insult to every servant who had earned their place in the castle through work, rather than a piece of paper signed between kings. "You will not be idle here," Ivy said, dropping a folded stack of linens into Illyra's arms without ceremony. "Whatever you were in the human lands, you are nothing but another set of hands in mine." "That suits me fine," Illyra answered, and something in her calm, unbothered tone seemed to unsettle Ivy more than any protest could have. The housekeeper studied her for a long moment, as if waiting for tears or anger that never came, before turning sharply on her heel and marching off to bark orders at someone else. The other servants were not cruel, not exactly, but they were wary, the way people are wary of anything they do not yet understand. They kept their distance in the kitchens, whispered when they thought she could not hear, and watched her from the corners of their eyes as she carried water and folded linens with the same quiet steadiness she had shown in the great hall the night before. It was the animals that gave her away first. By afternoon, 3 of the castle's hunting hounds had abandoned their usual post near the kennel gate to lie in a loose half-circle around the well, where Elira drew water, tails thumping softly against the stones whenever she passed. A pair of crows that normally scattered the moment any human approached the granary, instead perched on the low wall nearby, tilting their heads, watching her work with an attentiveness that unsettled the stable boy enough that he mentioned it, laughing nervously, to anyone who would listen. Word of these small, strange moments spread through the servants' quarters faster than any official announcement could have. By evening, even Ivy Marsh had grown quieter around her, though she would not have admitted to noticing anything at all. Draven heard none of it directly. He spent the day locked in council with his advisors, discussing border patrols and grain shortages, and the slow, grinding business of ruling a kingdom that had spent generations at war. It was easier, in that room full of maps and reports, to forget entirely that he had taken a wife the night before. It was easier still to forget the particular, unbothered steadiness in her voice when she had told him, in front of his entire court, that the weakness in the hall did not belong to her. He told himself he had forgotten it. He had not. That evening, alone in his private chambers long after the council had dispersed, Draven found himself standing at the tall window that overlooked the eastern courtyard, a glass of untouched wine cooling in his hand, his thoughts circling back again and again to a woman he had known for less than a day, and had already wronged in front of everyone whose respect he had spent his whole reign trying to earn. He told himself it did not matter what a human bride thought of him. He told himself many things, that night, standing at the window, watching the moon rise pale and full over the tree line his father and his father's father had spent their lives defending. He did not yet know that the woman he had called weak had spent that same night calming a biting pup with nothing but her hands and her voice, drawing the quiet attention of every animal within the castle walls, and catching the eye of the one person in Voss Castle old enough and wise enough to recognize what that meant. And so the first day of Elira Hastings's life, as the shamed human bride of the Alpha King, ended quietly, without fanfare, without anyone in that castle understanding that the woman they had cast aside as worthless carried, somewhere beneath her ordinary human skin, something none of them had seen walk among wolves in 1,000 years. 3 days passed before Mother Yara sought Elira out again, and in those 3 days, Elira learned the particular loneliness of living inside a house full of people who had already decided, before she said a single word, exactly who she must be. The servants no longer whispered when she entered a room, not because they had warmed to her, but because they had simply stopped noticing her, the way one stops noticing furniture. Ivy Marsh assigned her the dullest, most thankless chores, scrubbing pots blackened with years of soot, mending torn linens by candlelight until her fingers ached, carrying water up 3 flights of stairs, to chambers she was never permitted to enter for more than the length of a delivery. Elira did each task without complaint, because complaint, she had learned long ago, only ever fed the appetite of people who wanted to see her break. Draven did not send for her. He did not visit the servants' wing, did not inquire after her well-being, did not so much as speak her name within earshot of anyone who might carry the words back to her. To the castle, it seemed the marriage existed only on paper, a treaty fulfilled and then quietly forgotten, exactly as Draven had promised in the Great Hall. And yet Elira noticed things he did not know she noticed. She noticed the way his window overlooked the courtyard where she drew water each morning, and the way, twice now, she had caught a shape retreating from that window the instant she looked up. She noticed that despite his cruelty, he had given orders that she was never to go hungry, never to be denied a warm fire in her small room, small mercies delivered through the housekeeper without his name ever attached to them. She said nothing of these observations to anyone. She simply filed them away, the way she filed away everything, patiently, quietly, waiting to understand. It was on the 3rd evening, while she sat alone on the low stone bench outside the kitchen door, finally free of her duties for the night, that Mother Yara found her again. The old woman moved without sound, settling onto the far end of the bench as though she had always been sitting there, her pale eyes fixed not on Elira's face but on her hands, folded loosely in her lap. "You have not asked anyone in this castle what I meant," Yara said, without preamble, "about what I felt, watching you calm that pup. I assumed you would tell me when you were ready, Alira said. Or that you wouldn't tell me at all, and I would simply have to live with the wondering. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed Yara's weathered face. Patient, she murmured. That is rare, in the young. Rarer still, in someone who has just been shamed in front of an entire court and left to scrub pots for it. Anger doesn't scrub pots any faster, Alira said. I found that out a long time ago. Yara studied her for a long moment, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained, before she reached into the folds of her shawl and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a smooth gray stone, worn nearly flat by centuries of handling, etched with a symbol Alira did not recognize, a circle split by the outline of a running wolf. Give me your hand, Yara said. Alira hesitated only a moment before offering her palm. Yara pressed the stone into it, closing Alira's fingers around the cool surface with surprising gentleness. This stone, Yara said, has passed through the hands of every seer who has served this pack for longer than written record. It does one thing, and one thing only. It grows warm, in the presence of old blood. True old blood. Not the blood of any wolf born in the last 1,000 years, but the blood of the first line, the line the old stories say vanished when the first queen herself disappeared. Alira looked down at the stone in her palm, cool and unremarkable, and felt a small, foolish flicker of disappointment that nothing at all seemed to be happening. And then it grew warm. Not gradually, not like a stone left too long in sunlight, but suddenly, all at once, a heat blooming from its center, as though something inside it had woken and was reaching toward her skin. Alira gasped and nearly dropped it, but Yara's weathered hand closed over hers, steadying her, holding the stone in place. There, Yara breathed, and for the first time since Alira had met her, the old woman's composed, careful expression cracked open into something raw, something that looked almost like disbelief, mixed with relief, mixed with a grief so old it had turned to dust and settled somewhere deep in her bones. There it is. After all these years, I did not think I would live to see it. See what? Alira asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the warmth of the stone still pulsing faintly against her palm like something alive. What is happening to me? Yara did not answer immediately. She wrapped the stone back in its cloth with careful, reverent hands, tucking it away into her shawl before finally meeting Alira's eyes. Tell me again, she said, everything you know about how you came to be found near the tree line. Leave nothing out, however small it seems. Alira told her. She told her about the story her mother Grace had shared only once, reluctantly, when Alira was 12 and had finally asked why she looked nothing like either of her parents. She told her about the furs the infant had been wrapped in, furs too fine and strange for any human household in that region to have owned, and the silver chain found tangled around her tiny wrist, engraved with a symbol her parents had never been able to identify, and had eventually, out of caution more than indifference, melted down and sold, rather than risk drawing dangerous attention to their daughter. Yara's face grew graver with every detail, until by the end of it she sat very still, staring out at the darkening courtyard, as though seeing something far beyond the castle walls. What was the symbol? Yara asked quietly. Can you describe it? Alira closed her eyes, reaching back through years of memory, to a description she had heard only once, second-hand, from a mother who had been almost too frightened to repeat it. A circle, she said slowly, split by the shape of a running wolf, the same symbol on your stone. The old woman let out a long, unsteady breath, and for a moment, in the fading light of the courtyard, she looked less like a stern and ancient seer, and more like an old woman who had spent her entire life waiting for a single, impossible thing to happen, never quite allowing herself to believe it would. There is a story, Yara said finally, older than this castle, older than the treaty that bound you to our king, a story of the first queen, who ruled every pack under one banner, before pride and war split us into the fractured kingdoms you see today. The story says she vanished during the last great battle between packs, along with her infant daughter, spirited away by loyal hands to protect the bloodline from enemies who would have ended it entirely. The story says the line was never found again. Until now, most believed it lost forever. You think I am descended from her, Alira said slowly, hardly able to believe the shape the words took, even as she spoke them. You think that is why the animals— I do not think, Yara interrupted gently. I know what I felt. Standing in that courtyard, watching a pup that has bitten grown wolves go still, and trusting beneath your hands. I know what this stone has just told me. A stone that has stayed cold in the presence of every wolf, every servant, every noble guest who has passed through this castle in my lifetime. Whether you believe it yet or not, child, you carry something in your blood that this pack has not seen walk among us in 1,000 years. Elira sat in silence for a long moment, the warmth of the stone's memory still ghosting against her palm, the weight of Yara's words settling slowly over her like a heavy, unfamiliar cloak. What do I do with that? She finally asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Yara reached out and, with surprising tenderness, tucked a loose strand of hair behind Elira's ear, the gesture of someone far older addressing someone far younger, someone she had perhaps already, in her own private way, begun to think of as precious. For now, Yara said, you do nothing. You tell no one. Not the servants, not the guards, and especially not the king. Not until we understand more of what is happening within you, and why it has waited this long to wake. There are wolves in this castle, child, who would see the return of the first line as a threat to be ended, rather than a gift to be honored. Kael Voss chief among them. You must be patient a while longer. I am good at patient, Elira said, managing a faint, tired smile despite everything. It seems to be the only thing anyone has left me the room to be. Yara's expression softened, something almost maternal crossing her weathered face. That will not always be true, she said. I promise you that. Whatever this castle believes about you tonight, it will not believe it for very much longer. She rose from the bench, gathering her shawl around her thin shoulders, and paused only once more, before disappearing back into the shadows of the castle. Sleep well, Elira Hastings, she said, and keep that pup close, if he comes to your window again. Animals, unlike men, rarely lie about what they sense. Elira sat alone on the stone bench long after the old woman had gone, staring up at the same full moon that had risen over the tree line 3 nights before, on the evening she had been called weak in front of an entire court. She thought of the warm stone, the ancient symbol, the vanished first queen whose blood, according to a woman who had lived longer in that castle than any king, might now be quietly, impossibly, beating inside her own chest. She did not feel like a queen. She felt like a servant, with sore hands, and a heart still bruised from public humiliation. But somewhere beneath the ache, that same stubborn ember of curiosity from her first night in Voss Castle had grown into something steadier, something that almost, cautiously, resembled hope. Whatever she was becoming, she decided, sitting alone beneath a wolf kingdom's indifferent moon, she would not let anyone shame it out of her before she understood it herself. News of a quiet, unexplainable calm settling over the castle's animals whenever Elira passed had, by the end of the first week, become impossible for even the most dismissive courtiers to ignore, though none of them dared connect it to anything as significant as old legend. Instead, the stories that spread through Voss Castle grew smaller and pettier with each retelling, until the truth had been shrunk down to fit inside a shape the court found comfortable, a strange human girl with some minor, harmless gift for handling animals, nothing more. Kael Voss did not believe the small version of the story. Kael had spent his entire life a half step behind the throne, close enough to smell power, never close enough to hold it, and that particular closeness had sharpened him into someone who noticed things other wolves overlooked. He noticed, for instance, that Mother Yara, who had not left her private chambers for anything less than a funeral in over a decade, had now been seen in the servants' courtyard on 3 separate evenings, always near sunset, always near the human bride. He noticed that the castle's oldest hound, a grizzled, half-deaf animal that had bitten 2 stable boys that very year, now slept outside the door of a servant's room, rather than in its usual place by the kennel fire. He noticed, and he did not like what his instincts told him it might mean. You are wasting your suspicion on a scullery maid with a gentle hand for animals, Draven said flatly, when Kael raised the matter during a private council meeting 3 days after the wedding, the 2 of them alone in the map room long after the other advisors had departed. You would do better spending that energy on the grain shortage in the eastern villages. I would, Kael agreed smoothly, if Mother Yara were the sort of woman who wasted her attention on scullery maids. She has not looked twice at any servant in this castle in the 15 years I have known her, cousin. and yet she has looked at this one 3 times in a week." Draven said nothing, though something uneasy shifted behind his eyes, an itch of curiosity he was too proud to admit to feeling. "I only mean to protect what is yours," Cale went on, his tone carefully humble, carefully wounded, the tone he had perfected over years of navigating a court where humility was often the sharpest weapon available. "You humiliated her publicly, cousin. Rightly so, in my judgment. The treaty deserved no less honesty. But a woman humiliated in front of an entire court sometimes looks for ways to matter again. If Mother Yara has found something useful in her, something the girl could use to raise her own standing, you would do well to know of it before it becomes a problem you cannot easily undo." Draven's jaw tightened. He hated, more than almost anything, being told what he ought to already know, and he hated more still that some quiet, unwelcome part of him agreed with the shape of Cale's warning, even as he distrusted the source. "I will speak with Yara myself," Draven said finally, dismissing his cousin with a curt wave of his hand. "Leave the matter with me." He did not speak with Yara that day, or the next. Pride, once wounded, is slow and stubborn in its healing, and some buried part of Draven still flinched from the memory of Illyra's calm, unbothered voice in the great hall, telling him that the weakness in that room did not belong to her. He told himself he avoided the subject out of indifference. In truth, he avoided it because some part of him suspected, uneasily, that indifference was no longer entirely true, and he did not yet know what to do with whatever had replaced it. Illyra, meanwhile, continued her days unaware of the quiet war of suspicion being waged around her name in rooms she was never permitted to enter. She scrubbed pots. She carried water. She mended linens by candlelight, her fingers growing steadily more calloused, her patience growing steadily more worn, though never quite breaking. It was on the 9th day that Mother Yara came to her with a different kind of test. "There is a wolf in the lower kennels," Yara said, finding Illyra during her one free hour in the late afternoon, "that no handler in this castle has been able to approach in 3 years. He was taken as a rescue, found half-starved and badly wounded near the northern border, and whatever happened to him before he arrived here left him unwilling to trust any hand that comes near him, human or wolf. He has broken the arm of one careless handler and torn the ear of another. The king has debated more than once whether mercy requires putting him down." Illyra's stomach twisted at the thought. "You want me to see him?" "I want to see what happens when you do," Yara corrected gently. "Nothing more. If it frightens you, you may say so, and we will find another way." Illyra thought of the biting pup in the courtyard, calmed by nothing more than a soft voice and steady hands, and felt some quiet, curious courage stir beneath her nervousness. "Take me to him," she said. The lower kennels sat at the far edge of the castle grounds, a low stone building separated from the main kennels by a length of open yard, its single occupant kept apart from the other animals for everyone's safety. The wolf inside was enormous, even by the standards of the northern packs, his gray coat matted and scarred, one ear torn nearly in half, his eyes, when Illyra first saw them, wide and wild, with a terror that had long since curdled into something closer to rage. He threw himself against the bars the moment she stepped into view, snarling, teeth bared, the chain around his neck rattling violently against the stone floor. The kennel keeper, a broad, nervous man named Edmund Hart, moved immediately to pull Illyra back. "My lady, please, he has never let anyone this close without—" "Wait," Illyra said softly, holding up a hand, her eyes never leaving the wolf's wild, terrified gaze. "Please, just a moment." She did not approach the bars. She lowered herself instead to sit cross-legged on the cold stone floor several feet away, well outside his reach, and simply waited, her hands open and empty in her lap, her posture as unthreatening as she could make it. The wolf continued to snarl for a long while, pacing the narrow width of his cage, his scarred body rigid with a wariness that years of cruelty had clearly carved deep into him. Illyra said nothing. She simply sat, breathing slow and even, letting the silence between them stretch out longer than felt comfortable, longer than Edmund Hart seemed to think was wise, judging by the way he shifted anxiously near the door. Slowly, so slowly that at first Illyra almost did not notice it happening, the wolf's pacing began to slow. His snarl softened into a low, uncertain growl. His scarred ears, pinned flat against his skull since the moment she had entered, began, hesitantly, to rise. "I know," Elira murmured, still not moving closer, her voice pitched low and warm, the same tone she had once used to calm frightened animals on her parents' small farm, long before any king or treaty had entered her life. "I know someone hurt you badly enough that you don't trust hands anymore. I'm not asking you to trust mine. I'm only asking you to know that I'm not going to hurt you either." The wolf stopped pacing entirely. He stood at the far edge of his cage, his enormous chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths, watching her with an intensity that made even Mother Yara, standing quietly near the doorway, hold her breath. And then, impossibly, he lay down. Not fully at ease, not trusting, not yet, but lower, calmer, his scarred head resting on his massive paws, his wild eyes never leaving Elira's face, watching her the way a creature watches something it does not yet understand, but no longer believes, intends it harm. Edmund Hart made a small, strangled sound of disbelief from the doorway. 3 years, he said quietly, almost reverently. 3 years, and no one has ever gotten him to lie down like that. Elira remained seated a while longer, saying nothing more, simply letting her presence settle over the space, until the wolf's breathing slowed into something closer to rest. When she finally rose to leave, careful and unhurried, the wolf lifted his head to watch her go, and for the first time in 3 years, according to Edmund, he did not throw himself against the bars when a stranger walked away. Outside the kennel, in the fading afternoon light, Mother Yara studied Elira with an expression that had shifted, once again, from careful curiosity into something far more solemn. "That was not a small gift for animals," Yara said quietly. "That was command, child, the oldest kind, the kind that does not ask a creature to obey, but simply reminds it, somewhere in its blood, of a voice it was always meant to answer to." "I didn't do anything," Elira protested, still shaken by what had just happened, her hands trembling faintly at her sides. "I only sat there." "You only sat there," Yara repeated, something almost sad in her tone. "And an animal that has attacked every hand offered to it in 3 years, chose for the first time, to lie down and rest in your presence. That is not nothing, Elira. That is the first line, waking further inside you, with every passing day, whether you understand it yet or not." Word of what had happened in the lower kennels spread through the castle staff within hours, growing more exaggerated with each retelling, until by nightfall half the servants' wing swore the human bride had somehow tamed the castle's most dangerous animal, with nothing but a whispered word. Ivy Marsh, hearing the story secondhand from a wide-eyed kitchen girl, said nothing aloud, though she found herself, for the first time since Elira's arrival, watching the young woman across the kitchen, with something closer to uneasy curiosity than dismissal. Cale Voss heard the story too, delivered to him quietly, by a servant loyal to his purse, rather than his cousin's crown, and his expression, upon hearing it, grew sharp and calculating, in a way that boded ill for anyone standing between him and whatever advantage he believed the situation might yield. And in his private chambers, staring out once more at the darkening courtyard below, Draven Voss heard the story last of all, delivered reluctantly by the same young guard who had escorted Elira from the great hall on her first, humiliating night in the castle. "The wolf in the lower kennels," the guard said carefully, watching his king's face for reaction. "The one you nearly ordered put down last winter. She sat with him for less than an hour, my lord, and he lay down at her feet like a pup." Draven said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond his window, on the small, distant shape of a courtyard, where, 9 days earlier, he had called a woman weak in front of his entire court, without once considering what she might actually be capable of. "Leave me," he said finally, his voice quieter than the guard expected. Alone, Draven poured himself a glass of wine he did not drink, and sat with a feeling he refused to name, though it settled heavy and unfamiliar in his chest all the same, somewhere between shame and a curiosity he was no longer entirely able to suppress. The council chamber was full when Cale Voss finally made his move, choosing the moment carefully, the way he chose everything, for maximum effect in front of the widest possible audience. 10 days, Cale said, rising from his seat as the morning's business drew to a close, his voice pitched to carry across the long table of advisors and border captains. 10 days since the wedding, cousin, and already the castle speaks of nothing but the human bride and her unnatural hold over our animals. Servants whisper that she commands beasts with a look. Guards whisper that Mother Yara herself treats her like something sacred. And you, my king, have said nothing, nothing, as though a stranger's growing influence within these walls is beneath your notice. Draven's jaw tightened at the head of the table, aware of every eye now turned toward him, aware that Chaol had chosen this moment precisely because a public audience left him little room to deflect without appearing either weak or careless. "What would you have me do?" Draven said evenly. "Execute a woman for calming a frightened animal?" "I would have you remember what she is," Chaol pressed. "A human, placed among us by treaty, not by trust. If she is gathering influence among the servants, among Mother Yara, among the very animals this pact depends upon for hunting and defense, what happens the day that influence turns towards something less harmless than a biting pup? You humiliated her publicly on your wedding night, cousin. Have you considered that a woman humiliated so thoroughly might now be quietly building a foundation of loyalty beneath your notice, ready to use it however she sees fit?" It was a clever accusation, precisely because it was impossible to disprove and dangerous to ignore, and Draven felt the weight of it settle uncomfortably over the silent chamber. He did not believe, not truly, that Alira harbored some hidden scheme, and yet he could not say with confidence what she did believe, what she wanted, what she thought of him or his court, because he had not once, in 10 days, bothered to ask her. That realization sat badly with him, though he did not let it show on his face. "I will handle the matter," Draven said finally, his tone leaving no room for further argument, and the council moved on to other business, though the seed Chaol had planted remained lodged firmly in the chamber's collective mind long after the meeting ended. That evening, for the first time since the wedding, Draven sent for Alira directly. She arrived in the small private study off his chambers, still in her servant's plain gray dress, her hands reddened from a day of scrubbing, her expression carefully composed in a way that told him, immediately, that she expected nothing good from the summons. He could not blame her for that expectation. He had given her no reason to expect anything else. "You wish to see me, my lord," she said, standing just inside the doorway, making no move to sit, despite the empty chair across from his desk. Draven studied her for a long moment, searching for the scheming, ambitious stranger Chaol's warning had painted, and finding instead only a tired young woman, with ink-stained fingers, from an afternoon spent helping a kitchen girl with her letters, a detail he had learned only that morning, and had not expected to find as disarming as it was. "There are stories," Draven said carefully, "of a wolf, in the lower kennels, lying calm at your feet. Stories of a stone in Mother Yara's keeping, growing warm in your presence. My cousin believes you are gathering influence within my castle, for purposes I have not yet guessed at." "And what do you believe?" Alira asked, her tone neither defensive nor pleading, simply curious, as though his answer genuinely mattered to her more than his authority did. The question caught him off guard. He realized, uncomfortably, that he did not have a ready answer, that in 10 days, he had not once bothered to form an opinion of her, beyond the cruel, careless words he had spoken at their wedding feast. "I believe," he said slowly, choosing each word with more care than he had shown her since the moment they met, "that I owe you an apology I have been too proud to offer." Whatever Alira had expected walking into that room, it had clearly not been that. Something in her guarded posture eased, just slightly, though her eyes remained watchful, unwilling to trust the shift too quickly. "I said those things at our wedding to protect my own pride," Draven admitted, the words coming harder than he expected, unfamiliar in his mouth after a lifetime of never needing to apologize to anyone. "Not because I believed them to be true of you specifically. I knew nothing of you specifically. I chose cruelty, because cruelty was easier than admitting, in front of my entire court, that I resented a treaty I had no power to refuse." "You could have simply said that," Alira said quietly, "instead of calling me weak." "I know," Draven said. "It does not undo the saying of it. But I wanted you to hear, at least once, that it was never truly about you." Alira studied him for a long moment, weighing something behind her calm expression, before she finally crossed the room and took the chair he had offered earlier, settling into it with the same quiet composure she brought to everything. "I don't know what is happening to me," she admitted, softer now, the guardedness in her voice giving way to something more uncertain, more human. "The animals, the way they respond to me, the way Mother Yara looks at me like I'm something out of an old story. I don't have answers for you, my lord, because I don't have them for myself yet. Then perhaps, Draven said, surprising himself with the offer even as he made it, we find the answers together, rather than through rumor and my cousin's convenient suspicions. It was not friendship, not yet. Not trust rebuilt in a single evening after the damage of a single cruel night. But it was, for the first time since the wedding, a beginning, and both of them seemed to sense the fragile weight of that beginning, as the conversation gradually softened into something closer to ordinary talk. About the kingdom, about her life before the tree line had swallowed her past, about the strange, unfamiliar road that had led them both into a marriage neither had chosen. The peace did not last. 3 days later, Chaol struck again, and this time he did not bother with subtlety. He brought before the full council a border captain's report, claiming rogue wolves, exiled from every recognized pack, for crimes ranging from murder to treason, had been sighted gathering in unusual numbers near the southern border villages, closer to northern pack territory than they had come in years. It was, on its own, troubling but not unprecedented news. Rogue packs shifted territory often, driven by hunger and desperation more than strategy. But Chaol twisted the report into something sharper. The timing troubles me, Chaol said, his voice grave with practiced concern. Rogue wolves gathering so soon after a treaty bride enters our walls, a woman with an unexplained pull over animals that no one in this pack fully understands. I do not accuse her of anything directly, cousin. I only ask whether it is wise to keep such an unpredictable variable close to the heart of our kingdom while threats gather at our borders. It was an absurd leap of logic, and privately Draven knew it, but the council chamber, already primed by days of rumor, murmured with uneasy agreement, and Draven felt the familiar, suffocating weight of a king's decisions, never truly belonging only to himself. What would you have me do? Draven said again, the same question he had asked days earlier, though this time the answer Chaol offered was far more specific. Send her to the border, Chaol said. Let her prove her loyalty far from the heart of the kingdom, where any influence she carries can do no harm to the throne itself. If the rogue gathering proves nothing, she returns, none the worse. If it proves something, better it happens where the damage is contained. Draven wanted, badly, to refuse. He thought of the quiet evening 3 days earlier, of Alira's tired, ink-stained hands and her careful, honest answers, of the fragile beginning they had only just started building. But a king's decisions were rarely made in rooms empty of consequence, and the council's uneasy murmurs told him plainly that refusing Chaol's suggestion outright would cost him political ground he could not easily spare, with rogue wolves gathering at his borders and a court already suspicious of the human bride in his castle. He hated himself, in that moment, more than he had hated himself even on the night of the wedding. It will be done, Draven said, his voice flat, final, betraying none of the reluctance twisting beneath it. She leaves for the border villages within the week. He did not tell her himself. He let Chaol's men deliver the order, cold and official, and he told himself, once again, that it was simply the cost of ruling, the same lie he had told himself after the wedding feast, the same lie that had already cost him more than he yet understood. That night, alone in his chambers, his wolf refused to settle, pacing beneath his skin with a restlessness he could not explain and did not want to examine too closely, howling somewhere deep inside him for a mate he had just, once again, cast aside. The road south to the border villages took 4 days, and Alira spent most of it in silence, watching the dense northern forests slowly give way to open, rolling farmland, dotted with small stone cottages and fields of late-season wheat. The 2 guards assigned to escort her, an older wolf named Simon Blake and a younger one, who never gave his name, spoke little, though neither treated her with the open contempt she had grown used to at court. If anything, they seemed faintly embarrassed by the assignment, unwilling to meet her eyes for more than a moment at a time. She did not ask them why she had truly been sent away. She already understood, well enough, that political convenience wore many disguises, and that hers had been dressed up as loyalty testing, dressed up as protection. She had stopped expecting fairness from Voss Castle, somewhere around the 3rd day of scrubbing pots. She had not, however, stopped feeling the sting of it, especially after the quiet evening in Draven's study, after the fragile beginning she had allowed herself to hope might mean something. She pushed the disappointment down and focused instead on the village ahead, a modest cluster of stone and timber buildings called Ashwood, nestled against the tree line, where wolf territory finally gave way to open human farmland. It was, she thought as they approached, the closest thing to her childhood home she had seen since the wedding, and something in her chest eased slightly at the familiar sight of chickens scratching in dusty yards, and children chasing each other between wash lines strung with drying linen. The village healer, a sharp-eyed, capable woman named Nora Fenwick, met them at the edge of town with the wary curiosity of someone who had clearly already heard rumors of the strange human bride sent south from the capital. "So you're the one they're all whispering about," Nora said, studying Alira with open, unapologetic assessment. "Come to spy on us for the king, have you?" "Come because the king's cousin wanted me somewhere less convenient," Alira said honestly, too tired from 4 days of travel to bother softening the truth. "I don't imagine I'll be spying on anyone. Mostly, I intend to make myself useful and stay out of trouble." Something in her blunt honesty seemed to disarm Nora more effectively than any careful diplomacy could have. The healer's stern expression cracked into something almost like approval. "Well," she said, "trouble has a way of finding this village on its own, treaty bride or not. We're close enough to open wolf territory that rogue packs pass through more often than the capital likes to admit. You'll earn your keep soon enough, one way or another." Nora's words proved more prophetic than either of them could have guessed. Alira settled into a small cottage at the edge of the village, close enough to the tree line that she could hear the forest's nighttime sounds clearly through her shuttered window, distant owls and the occasional far-off howl that no longer frightened her the way it once might have. She spent her days helping Nora tend the sick and injured, learning the names of village children within a week, earning cautious trust from people who had initially eyed her with the same wariness Voss Castle had shown on her first night. The attack came on the 9th night, without warning, the way true danger rarely announces itself in advance. Alira woke to screaming. She was on her feet and out the cottage door before her mind had fully caught up with her body, some deep instinct driving her toward the sound rather than away from it, and what she found in the village square stole the breath entirely from her lungs. Rogue wolves, easily 24 of them, tore through the village with a savagery that had nothing of the ordered discipline she had seen among Draven's court. These were desperate, starving creatures, exiled and hunted, driven now by hunger and rage into the one place they might find easy prey. Villagers scrambled for whatever shelter they could find, screaming, some already wounded, the 2 guards assigned to Alira's protection, fighting desperately against wolves twice their number, already bleeding, already losing ground. Nora Fenwick stood in the doorway of her healer's cottage, a kitchen knife clutched uselessly in her shaking hand. 3 snarling wolves advancing on her with slow, predatory patience. Alira did not think. She simply moved, running toward the danger rather than away from it, some instinct older than fear driving her feet across the dusty square. "Stop," she said, and her voice, when it left her throat, did not sound entirely like her own. It came out deeper, resonant, carrying a weight that seemed to physically press against the air itself, and every wolf in the village square, rogue and loyal guard alike, froze mid-motion, as though an invisible hand had reached out and stilled them all at once. Alira felt something shift inside her, a door long sealed, suddenly wrenched open, and for one dizzying, overwhelming moment, the entire world seemed to slow around her. She could feel, with a clarity she had no words for, the pulse of every wolf in that square, their fear, their hunger, their desperate, animal confusion, at the sudden, overwhelming presence that had just filled the air like a physical force. She raised a hand, though she could not later say exactly why, some instinct guiding the gesture more than conscious thought, and the nearest rogue wolf, a scarred, half-starved creature with murder still burning in its wild eyes, sank slowly, helplessly, to its belly in the dust, a low whine escaping its throat. One by one, the others followed. It was not gentle, the way it had been with the biting pup in the courtyard, or the wounded wolf in the lower kennels. This was not calm coaxing, or patient trust-building. This was command, absolute and undeniable, an authority so deeply woven into her blood that every wolf within earshot felt it in their bones, before their minds could even begin to question it. 24 rogue wolves, driven mad by hunger and desperation only moments before, lowered themselves to the ground in submission, whining, trembling, their wild violence draining away beneath the weight of a voice that some ancient, buried instinct in their blood recognized as belonging to something above them. Illyra stood in the center of the village square, her chest heaving, her own eyes, though she could not see them herself, burning with a faint, unmistakable gold that had never shone in them before, and for one long, suspended moment, the entire world held its breath around her. Simon Blake, bleeding from a gash along his forearm, stared at the scene before him with an expression somewhere between disbelief and dawning terror. Villagers peered out from doorways and broken windows, too stunned to move, watching a human woman stand unarmed and untouched in the center of 24 submitted wolves, like something out of legend made suddenly, impossibly real. The moment broke when one of the rogue wolves, larger and more scarred than the rest, lifted its head slowly from the dust, its wild eyes fixed on Illyra not with fear, but with something closer to recognition, a deep, ancient understanding settling over its feral features. "My queen," it said, and the words, though spoken through a wolf's throat, carried a clarity that left no doubt they had been meant. "We did not know. We did not know you walked among us again." Illyra's breath caught. The gold in her eyes flickered, uncertain, the overwhelming rush of power beginning to recede as quickly as it had risen, leaving her suddenly, dizzyingly aware of just how impossible the scene around her truly was. "I don't understand," she said, her voice shaking now, human again, uncertain again, the towering authority of moments before draining out of her as fast as it had come. "What did you just call me?" The scarred wolf did not answer immediately. Instead, its form began to shift, bones cracking, and reshaping with the swift, practiced ease of a wolf, long accustomed to walking on two legs, until where a creature had knelt in the dust, a man now stood instead, tall and gaunt, his human face carrying the same deep scars as his wolf form, his dark eyes fixed on Illyra, with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "Owen Ashford," the man said, offering something between a bow and a collapse, exhaustion and awe warring visibly across his scarred features. "Once of the Ironwood Pack, exiled for refusing to abandon the old faith, when my alpha demanded it. We are rogues, my queen, because we would not stop believing the first line still lived somewhere in this world. Because we would not stop waiting." Behind him, the other wolves, some still in animal form, some beginning to shift into human shape as well, all watched Illyra with the same stunned, reverent awe, exhaustion and hunger, forgotten entirely, beneath the weight of what had just happened in that dusty village square. Illyra looked around at the wreckage of the attack, at the wounded villagers slowly emerging from hiding, at Nora Fenwick staring at her from the healer's doorway, with an expression of complete, speechless astonishment, at 24 wolves, who moments earlier had been trying to kill everyone in sight, now kneeling in the dust before her, as though she were something out of ancient prophecy finally, impossibly made real. "I am not a queen," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she felt the hollow, uncertain shape of them, felt the warm stone from Mother Yara's palm, the biting pup gone suddenly gentle, the wounded wolf, lying calm at her feet for the first time in 3 years, all of it pressing now toward a truth she could no longer push away. Owen Ashford lifted his scarred face toward hers, and though his voice remained rough and low, there was no doubt in it at all. "You are my queen," he said, "whether you have known it until tonight or not. The blood in your veins just told 24 desperate dying wolves to lay down and be still, and they obeyed, because some part of every wolf still living remembers exactly whose voice that is." By the time riders reached Voss Castle 3 days later carrying word of what had happened in the border village of Ashwood, the story had already outpaced them, carried faster by wolf speed and wolf gossip than any human messenger could manage, growing larger and stranger with every retelling until it reached the capital, not as a rumor, but as something closer to certainty. The human bride the king had shamed and cast aside was no ordinary woman at all. Mother Yara arrived in Ashwood 2 days after the attack, traveling faster than her aged frame should reasonably have allowed, driven by an urgency that left even her escort struggling to keep pace. She found Illyra sitting on the low stone wall outside Nora Fenwick's cottage, staring out at the tree line with the distant, unfocused gaze of someone whose entire understanding of herself had been upended in the space of a single night. "They call me their queen," Illyra said. before Yara had even finished dismounting, her voice hollow with a kind of exhausted disbelief that had not faded in 2 full days. 24 rogue wolves, kneeling in the village square. A man named Owen Ashford, telling me the blood in my veins belongs to something out of legend. I don't know what to do with any of it, Mother Yara. I don't know who I am anymore. Yara settled onto the wall beside her, with the careful, deliberate movements of someone whose joints had grown weary decades ago, and for a long moment, she said nothing at all, simply letting the silence settle between them, the way it had that first night in the courtyard, when a stone had grown warm in Alira's palm, and an old woman's entire understanding of the world had quietly begun to shift. "Show me your wrist," Yara said finally. Alira frowned, confused, but obeyed, turning her arm over to reveal the pale underside of her wrist. Yara studied it closely, tracing one weathered finger along a faint, silvery mark, just below the crease of skin, a mark Alira had carried her entire life, and had always assumed was nothing more than an old, faded scar from some forgotten childhood injury. "Do you know what this is?" Yara asked quietly. "A scar," Alira said. "I've had it as long as I can remember." "It is not a scar," Yara said. "It is the Queen's mark, child. A birthmark, carried only by direct descendants of the first Wolf Queen, passed down through a bloodline the Pax believed extinguished 1,000 years ago, when the first Queen vanished during the last Great War between the fractured territories. I have read of this mark in texts older than this kingdom's founding. I have never, in all my years, expected to see it carried on living skin." Alira stared down at the faint silver line on her wrist, as though seeing it for the first time, though she had lived with it, unremarked and unremarkable, her entire life. "My mother, Grace," she said slowly, memory stirring uneasily. "She used to say I was found wrapped in furs too fine for our village, with a silver chain around this very wrist. She said the chain bore a symbol she didn't recognize, and she was frightened enough of what it might mean that she sold it, rather than risk anyone asking questions about where an ordinary farming family had come by such a fine, strange thing. The symbol on your chain," Yara said quietly, "was almost certainly the same symbol carried on the stone I showed you that first night. The mark of the running wolf within the circle, the sigil of the first line." "Then how?" Alira asked, her voice unsteady now, the careful composure she had maintained through 2 days of stunned disbelief finally beginning to crack. "How did I end up an infant, abandoned near a village tree line, if I truly am what you and Owen Ashford believe I am? Why would anyone abandon a queen?" Yara's expression grew solemn, weighted with old grief she had clearly carried alone for far too long. "The old stories say the first queen vanished during the final battle of the Great Pack Wars, along with her infant daughter, spirited away by loyal hands who feared enemies close to the throne, meant to end the bloodline entirely, rather than allow it to continue. If that story is true, and if you are who I now believe you to be, then whoever carried you to safety chose to hide you among humans, precisely because no wolf pack, friend or enemy, would think to search for the lost heir of the first line, inside a human village. They chose to hide me," Alira repeated slowly, "and then died, or disappeared, or simply left me at the tree line for a stranger to find, because it was safer for me to grow up not knowing any of this at all." "It would seem so," Yara said gently. "I am sorry, child, that no one was left to tell you the truth sooner. I am sorry that you learned it instead, in the middle of a rogue wolf attack, surrounded by strangers, kneeling in the dust, and calling you by a title you had no chance to prepare for." Alira sat with that for a long moment, staring out at the same tree line that had, 22 years earlier, swallowed whatever truth might have explained her entire life, and felt something complicated settle in her chest. Not quite grief, not quite wonder, but some uneasy mixture of both. "What happens now?" she finally asked. "Now," Yara said, "word of what happened here will reach the capital, if it has not already. Word travels faster among wolves than any human messenger, and 24 witnesses do not stay quiet about the return of a queen the old stories say the Pax have waited 1,000 years to see again. Whatever peace you found in anonymity, Alira, it is very likely already gone." The old woman's prediction proved accurate within the day. Owen Ashford and his rogue followers had not left Ashwood since the night of the attack, choosing instead to camp at the edge of the tree line, unwilling to abandon the queen they had waited a lifetime to find, and their presence alone drew curious, wary attention from every traveler passing through the village. By the time a second group of riders arrived from the capital, this time bearing the personal seal of Alpha King Draven Voss himself, half the border region already spoke in hushed, excited whispers of the lost queen found living quietly among them. Elira watched the royal riders approach from the edge of the village, with a complicated tangle of emotions she could not easily untangle. Part dread, part something that felt uncomfortably close to hope. And beside her, Mother Yara watched the same riders with an expression far more guarded. "Whatever the king intends by sending riders so quickly," Yara murmured, "be careful, child. A crown that once called you weak may now scramble to call you something else entirely, and not always for reasons that serve you rather than itself." Elira thought of the quiet evening in Draven's study, of his halting, unfamiliar apology, of the fragile beginning they had allowed themselves to hope might grow into something real, before Kael's suspicions had cut it short. She did not know, watching the royal banners approach through the dust of the road, whether that beginning still meant anything at all, now that everything about who she was had changed so completely, so suddenly, that even she was still struggling to recognize herself. She straightened her shoulders, the same way she had in the great hall on her wedding night, and waited to see what kind of king would step down from those horses, the cruel one who had called her weak, or someone else entirely, someone she had only just begun, in one quiet evening, to hope might exist beneath the crown. The news reached Draven 3 days before his riders reached Ashwood, delivered by a border scout who arrived at Voss Castle, so exhausted from hard riding that he could barely stand upright in the throne room, gasping out a story so strange that half the council initially refused to believe it. Rogue wolves, kneeling in submission before the human bride, a voice that stopped a village massacre in its tracks. A man named Owen Ashford, once of the Ironwood Pack, calling her queen, in front of 24 witnesses, and a healer, who would swear to the truth of it on anything the council cared to name. Draven sat very still on his throne as the scout finished his account, and for a long moment the entire chamber held its breath, waiting for their king's reaction to news that upended everything the court believed it understood about the treaty bride he had publicly humiliated less than a month earlier. "Say it again," Draven said finally, his voice carefully controlled, betraying nothing of the storm building beneath it. The exact words the rogue used. "My queen," the scout repeated. He called her my queen. "Your Majesty," and knelt before her along with every other wolf in that square, rogue and guard alike. "The healer confirms it. Both of your escort guards confirm it. There is no doubt among any witness what they saw." Draven rose from his throne slowly, and the movement alone seemed to draw the air tight throughout the chamber, courtiers and advisors instinctively straightening, sensing the shift in their king's bearing even before he spoke again. "Mother Yara," he said, "has she reached the border villages?" "She left 3 days past, Your Majesty. The moment word first reached the capital, through faster, unofficial channels. She is very likely already at Ashwood." Kael Voss, who had been unusually silent throughout the scout's report, finally spoke from his seat near the council table, his voice carrying a careful, calculated neutrality that did not entirely mask the sharp calculation working visibly behind his eyes. "If this is true, cousin," he said, "if the treaty bride truly carries the blood of the first line, then the situation has grown considerably more delicate than a matter of political convenience. The Queen's bloodline, should it prove genuine, holds authority the old laws recognize as superseding even the crown of any single Pax Alpha King." "I am aware of the old laws, Kael," Draven said sharply, though the words landed with less conviction than he intended, because in truth, he had not fully considered, until his cousin spoke it aloud, exactly how thoroughly the ground beneath his own throne might be shifting. "Then you understand," Kael pressed, "that how you handle what has happened in Ashwood will determine far more than the fate of one treaty bride. If the Pax come to believe the lost queen has returned, and that their Alpha King humiliated her publicly on the night of their wedding, cast her from his court, and exiled her to a border village where she was nearly killed in a rogue attack, the political cost to your throne could be severe. Every rival pack currently biding time under your banner may see this as the opportunity they have waited generations for, a chance to challenge Northern Pack authority, by claiming loyalty instead to a queen you yourself so publicly wronged." Draven's hands clenched at his sides, the truth of his cousin's warning landing with an uncomfortable precision that made it impossible to dismiss as mere political maneuvering. He thought of the great hall on his wedding night, of the word weakness leaving his mouth in front of 300 witnesses, of every cruel, careless choice he had made in the weeks since, each one now stacking up into a debt he was only beginning to understand the true weight of. "I am not concerned only with political cost," Draven said quietly, and something in his tone made even Cale pause, uncertain, unable to fully read the shift in his cousin's expression. "I wronged her, Cale. Whatever bloodline she carries, whatever title the old laws grant her, I wronged a woman who did nothing to deserve the cruelty I showed her, and I have spent every day since telling myself it did not matter, because admitting otherwise felt too costly to my pride." The council chamber fell into an uneasy silence, courtiers exchanging uncertain glances, unused to hearing their king speak with such raw, unguarded honesty in front of a full assembly. "I ride for Ashwood myself," Draven said, his decision settling over him with sudden, unshakable clarity. "Not with an army, not with a show of political force meant to reclaim whatever advantage her bloodline might offer this throne. I ride to speak with my wife, and to face whatever judgment she deems fit to offer me, crown or no crown." "Cousin, consider the optics of—" "I have considered the optics for weeks, Cale," Draven interrupted, sharper now, the weight of weeks of buried guilt finally finding an outlet. "I considered them when I called her weak, in front of this entire court. I considered them when I let your suspicions send her to a border village, rather than trusting my own judgment. I am done considering optics at the expense of doing what is right." He left the council chamber within the hour, taking only a small escort, riding hard for the southern road, before the shock of his declaration had even fully settled over the courtiers left behind in his wake. The 4-day journey felt longer than any Draven had made in years, his mind circling endlessly through every cruel word, every missed opportunity, every small, cowardly choice that had led him to this moment, riding desperately toward a border village, to face a woman he had wronged so thoroughly that an entire kingdom's political future might now hinge on whether she could ever bring herself to forgive him. He thought of her voice in the great hall, steady even as he humiliated her. He thought of her tired, ink-stained hands in his study, and the careful, honest answers she had offered him, despite every reason she had to distrust his sudden interest. He thought of the biting pup gone calm beneath her touch, the wounded wolf lying at her feet for the first time in 3 years, and understood now, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, exactly what kind of woman he had so carelessly called weak. She was not weak. She had never been weak. She was, he now understood, quite possibly the single most powerful person in his entire kingdom, and he had spent the first weeks of their marriage trying to shame her into smallness, rather than recognizing what stood in front of him all along. By the time the spires of Ashwood's small chapel came into view on the horizon, Draven Voss no longer rode as a king, weighing political advantage. He rode, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, as a man desperate to make right a wrong he had convinced himself, for far too long, did not matter. He did not yet know whether she would grant him the chance. Elira watched Draven dismount at the edge of Ashwood's village square, his small escort holding back at a respectful distance, and felt none of the satisfaction she had once imagined she might feel, watching the man who had shamed her arrive looking so uncertain, so far removed from the cold, commanding king who had called her weak in front of his entire court. She felt, instead, a wary, guarded tiredness, unwilling to trust that this humbled version of him would last any longer than the fragile beginning they had built in his study, 3 days before Cale's suspicions had ended it. Owen Ashford and a dozen of his rogue followers positioned themselves without being asked, forming a loose, protective half-circle around her, their posture making clear, without a single word spoken, exactly whose authority they now recognized in that village square. Draven's escort shifted uneasily at the sight, unused to seeing rogue wolves stand so boldly in defense of anyone, let alone in open challenge to their own king's approach. Draven raised a hand, a clear signal for his men to hold their position, and walked the remaining distance alone, stopping several feet from where Elira stood, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to make clear he had not come to claim or command anything by force. "They tell me you saved this village," he said quietly, "that you stopped a rogue attack with nothing but your voice. They tell you correctly, Elira said, her tone even, careful, giving nothing away. They tell me other things as well, Draven said. Things about a bloodline, and a title, and a birthmark on your wrist that Mother Yara believes marks you as something this kingdom has not seen in 1,000 years. They tell you correctly about that too, Elira said. I am, apparently, the lost queen of every wolf pack, currently squabbling beneath your banner, and every rival territory beyond it. A rather significant discovery for a woman you called weak and sent to scrub pots less than a month ago. The words landed exactly as sharp as she intended them to, and Draven did not flinch from them, accepting the blow with the same quiet resolve he had ridden 4 hard days to deliver. I know, he said simply. I have thought of little else since the scout's report reached my throne room. I have thought of the word weakness leaving my mouth in front of 300 witnesses, knowing now what I did not know then, that I stood in front of my own court, insulting a woman whose bloodline holds authority the old laws recognize as greater than my own. But that is not why I rode here, Elira. I did not ride 4 days to grovel before a queen, because I fear what her title might cost my throne. Then why did you ride here? Elira asked, and for the first time since he arrived, something in her carefully controlled voice cracked slightly, revealing the exhaustion and hurt she had carried, unspoken, since the night of their wedding. Because I wronged you, Draven said, long before I knew what you were, and that wrong does not become smaller now that I understand what I actually threw away. I called you weak, because I was too proud to admit I resented a treaty that stripped me of choice, and I let that pride cost you dignity you never deserved to lose. I sent you here, to a border village where you were nearly killed, because my cousin's suspicions were easier to entertain than the harder work of trusting my own judgment about a woman I had barely bothered to know. None of that changes because you turned out to be a queen, Elira. It was wrong when I believed you were only a treaty bride with no power at all, and it remains wrong now. Elira studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the calculated political maneuvering Mother Yara had warned her to watch for, and found instead something that looked, uncomfortably, like genuine remorse, raw and unpolished in a way she had not expected from a king so practiced in careful, guarded authority. Pretty words are easy to offer a queen you can no longer safely dismiss, she said, though the sharpness in her voice had begun, despite herself, to soften. They were harder to find, for a treaty bride you believed carried no consequence for cruelty. You are right to distrust the timing, Draven admitted. I would distrust it myself, in your position. I only ask that you judge me, eventually, not by how quickly I apologized once your bloodline became undeniable, but by what I do from this point forward, knowing full well that you owe me nothing, crown or no crown, blood or no blood. Owen Ashford shifted at the edge of the protective circle, his scarred face tight with wary suspicion, clearly unwilling to trust a king who had, by his own admission, humiliated their queen so thoroughly on the very night he claimed her as his wife. My queen, he said quietly, you do not owe this man your forgiveness. Whatever the old treaty demands, your authority now supersedes his own. You need not stand here and listen to excuses dressed up as apology. I know, Elira said, without looking away from Draven. I know exactly what I do and do not owe him, Owen. But I would rather make that choice with clear eyes than let anger alone decide it for me. She turned back to Draven, studying him a moment longer, weighing 4 days of hard, uncertain travel against weeks of humiliation and careless cruelty, weighing the fragile, honest evening in his study against the swift, cold order that had sent her south into danger days later. I am not ready to forgive you, she said finally, each word deliberate, unhurried. Not because I doubt every word you have said today, but because words, however honest, have not yet been tested against time. You will have to earn back what your pride destroyed, Draven Voss, slowly, and without the comfort of assuming a crown, or a bloodline, owes you an easier path to it. Something in Draven's expression eased, not with relief exactly, but with something close to it, the quiet acknowledgement of a chance, offered rather than a door closed entirely. That is more grace than I expected, he admitted, and more than I deserve, on the evidence you have of me so far. Perhaps, Elira said, or perhaps I simply understand, better than most, what it costs to be judged entirely by a single night's cruelty, rather than a lifetime's worth of character. I would rather offer you the same patience I wished someone had offered me, on my wedding night, before deciding what kind of person you truly are." Behind her, Owen Ashford said nothing further, though the tension in his scarred shoulders eased slightly, some grudging respect settling into his wary expression at the quiet strength in his queen's measured judgment. Beyond the village, gathering slowly at the edge of the tree line, where word of the lost queen's return had already begun spreading to rival territories, eager to test the shifting balance of power, other eyes watched the scene unfold with far less patience and far more ambition than either Draven or Alira yet understood. The messenger from the Ironwood pack arrived at Ashwood 8 days after Draven's own arrival, riding under a banner of grey and black, his expression carrying the same careful arrogance Alira had come to associate with wolves, who believed strength alone should decide every question worth asking. "Alpha Simon Blake of the Ironwood pack," the messenger announced, though Alira noted, with some private amusement, that this was a different Simon Blake entirely from the guard who had escorted her south weeks earlier. "Extends an invitation to the lost queen. He proposes she abandon her claim to the Northern Pack's treaty, and instead accept the protection and leadership of Ironwood territory, where her bloodline will be honored properly, rather than treated as an inconvenient afterthought to a marriage built on humiliation." Owen Ashford's scarred face darkened immediately at the message, a low growl building in his throat, before Alira raised a hand to still him. "Tell your Alpha," Alira said evenly, "that I have not yet decided what I intend to do with the bloodline I only recently learned I carry, and that decision will not be made under pressure from a pack seeking political advantage, rather than genuine loyalty." The messenger's expression flickered with something like disappointment, though he offered a stiff bow before riding back toward the tree line, and Draven, standing nearby, watched him go with a grim, unsurprised expression. "That will not be the last such offer," he said quietly. "Every pack currently under my banner, and several beyond it, will see the return of the first line as an opportunity too significant to ignore. Some will court your favor with honeyed words. Others, when honeyed words fail, may attempt something less patient." His prediction proved accurate within days. A second rogue attack struck Ashwood 11 nights later, larger and better organized than the first, wolves bearing the unmistakable gray and black markings of Ironwood territory, rather than the desperate, starving chaos of true rogues. This was not hunger driving them. This was calculated pressure, an attempt to force Alira's hand by threatening the village that had sheltered her, betting that fear for innocent lives would push her toward accepting Ironwood's offer, where diplomacy alone had failed. Alira's power, still new and unpracticed, met the attack with less certainty than it had the first time, the overwhelming rush of command harder to summon deliberately than it had been in the desperate instinct of that first terrifying night. She managed to still perhaps half the attacking force before her concentration wavered, the effort leaving her shaking and disoriented, and it was Draven, fighting at her side with a fury she had not expected from him, who held the line against the remainder, until Owen Ashford's rogues could rally and drive the attackers back into the tree line. "You could have been killed," Alira said afterward, finding him in the healer's cottage where Nora Fenwick tended a deep gash along his shoulder, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes still sharp, still watching her with the same careful attention he had shown since arriving in Ashwood. "So could you," Draven said. "I would rather stand between you and that danger than watch from a safe distance while you face it alone, whatever grace you have, or have not yet decided to offer me." Nora finished stitching the wound with brisk efficiency, muttering something under her breath about stubborn wolves and stubborn kings, before leaving the two of them alone in the small, candlelit room. "Ironwood will not stop with a single failed attack," Draven said, once the healer had gone. "Simon Blake has spent years quietly building resentment against my throne, gathering allies among packs who felt slighted by my father's rule and my own. The return of the first line gives him a legitimate banner to rally behind, whether or not he genuinely believes in the old faith Owen Ashford and his followers have carried for years." "Then what do we do?" Alira asked, exhaustion evident in her voice, the weight of decisions she had never asked to carry, settling heavier with each passing day. "We do not let fear decide for you," Draven said firmly. "Not fear of Ironwood's ambition, and not fear of trusting me too quickly simply because circumstance has thrown us into danger together. Whatever you decide about this kingdom, about the packs, about the bloodline you carry, it must be your decision. made with clear judgment rather than pressure from any direction, mine included. It was, Elira thought, watching him wince as he shifted his bandaged shoulder, exactly the kind of answer she would not have expected from the man who had called her weak in front of 300 witnesses only weeks earlier, and something in that quiet consistency, offered again and again since his arrival in Ashwood, had begun, slowly, cautiously, to earn back more of her trust than she had expected to give so soon. The final confrontation came 10 days later, when Simon Blake himself arrived at the edge of Ashwood's tree line, with a force large enough to make clear that diplomacy had entirely given way to open challenge. Dozens of ironwood wolves arrayed in formation, their alpha standing at the front in human form, tall and broad-shouldered, his expression carrying the confident arrogance of a man who believed himself already victorious. "Lost Queen," Simon Blake called across the open field separating the two forces, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "I offer you one final chance to abandon a throne built on humiliation and accept the protection Ironwood has offered from the start. Refuse again, and we will simply take what your bloodline is unwilling to give freely." Elira stepped forward, Draven at her side, Owen Ashford and his rogue followers arrayed behind them, alongside Draven's own gathered guard, and felt, for the first time since the night of the first attack, the full, undeniable weight of her bloodline rising within her, not as an overwhelming, uncontrolled instinct, but as something she had begun, slowly, to understand and command with growing confidence. "You mistake patience for weakness, Alpha Blake," Elira said, her voice carrying the same resonant authority that had once stilled 24 desperate rogues in a single terrified night, though now it came with deliberate control rather than instinctive panic. "I have offered no pack loyalty, because loyalty offered under threat is worth nothing at all. You have proven, twice now, exactly why I would never place this bloodline's authority in your hands." Simon Blake's confident expression flickered, just slightly, at the unwavering steadiness in her voice, and behind him, several of his own gathered wolves shifted uneasily, some clearly recognizing, even from a distance, the unmistakable pull of true first-line authority, now directed squarely at their own ranks. "Then we take it by force," Simon Blake said, though his voice carried less certainty than it had moments before, and he raised a hand to signal his forces forward. What happened next would be told and retold throughout every pack territory for years afterward, the story growing and shifting with each retelling, though those who stood in that field that morning agreed on one detail above all others. The moment Simon Blake's forces surged forward, Elira Hastings, once dismissed by an entire royal court as nothing more than a weak, inconvenient treaty bride, stood her ground without flinching, and the full, undeniable weight of a bloodline the Pax had waited 1,000 years to see again, rose to meet the challenge. The power that rose within Elira, in that open field beyond Ashwood's tree line, felt nothing like the desperate, instinctive surge that had stilled the rogue attack weeks earlier. It felt, instead, like something ancient finally recognizing itself fully for the first time. A door that had stood ajar for weeks, now swinging open entirely, and when her voice rang out across the field, every wolf present, Ironwood and Northern Pack alike, felt the ground itself seemed to still beneath the weight of it. "Enough," she said, and the single word carried further than any shout could have, reaching every ear across that open field, with a clarity that admitted no argument. Simon Blake's advancing forces did not merely hesitate. They stopped entirely, paws and boots alike rooted to the earth, as though some invisible hand had reached out and closed around every advancing body at once, and even Simon Blake himself, striding forward with confident fury only moments before, found his own steps faltering, some deep, ancestral instinct in his blood refusing to carry him any closer against a will so clearly, undeniably greater than his own. "You call yourself Alpha of Ironwood," Elira said, walking forward now, unhurried, unafraid, her eyes burning gold in the morning light. "And yet you kneel to a will your own blood recognizes as older and greater than your title. That recognition is not weakness in you, Simon Blake. It is simply truth, the same truth every wolf pack fractured from this land 1,000 years ago, when pride convinced them unity was a weakness rather than a strength." Simon Blake's jaw worked silently, torn between decades of ambition and an instinct he could not override, and slowly, visibly, The fight drained from his broad shoulders, his knees bending despite himself, until he knelt in the dust of the very field where he had come to conquer. One by one, his gathered forces followed, kneeling across the open ground in a wave that spread outward from their fallen alpha, until the entire Ironwood force knelt silent and still, before a queen they had ridden out that morning intending to defeat. Elira stood before them for a long moment, the weight of an entire kingdom's fractured history settling over her shoulders, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, exactly what the old stories had always meant when they spoke of the first queen uniting every pack under a single banner. It was not conquest. It was recognition, offered freely, once fear and pride no longer stood in its way. "Rise," she said finally, her voice gentler now, though no less certain. "I do not want packs that kneel from fear alone. I want packs that choose unity, because they understand, finally, what division has cost this land for 1,000 years. If you wish to follow me, Simon Blake, you will follow, because you have chosen peace over pride, not because I forced you to your knees in an open field." Simon Blake rose slowly, his earlier arrogance replaced by something far more uncertain, far more human, and for the first time since arriving at Ashwood's tree line, he looked at Elira not as an obstacle to be removed, but as something he had genuinely, finally, begun to believe in. "I misjudged you," he admitted, his voice rough. "I believed a queen returned from legend would demand tribute and conquest, the same currency every pack has traded in for 1,000 years. I did not expect mercy offered freely instead." "Mercy," Elira said, "is not weakness, Alpha Blake. It never was. That is a lesson this land has needed to learn for far longer than either of us has been alive." In the days that followed, word of what had happened in that open field spread across every pack territory, faster than any royal messenger could carry it, growing not into exaggerated rumor this time, but into something the packs, exhausted after generations of fractured war, seemed almost desperate to believe. One by one, alphas who had spent years testing the boundaries of Northern Pack authority sent word, instead of quiet, hopeful loyalty, not to a crown built on treaty and force, but to a bloodline that had proven, in a single open field, that unity could be offered through strength without cruelty. Draven stood beside Elira through each of those following weeks, watching her build, slowly and deliberately, something his own father and grandfather had never managed in a lifetime of ruling through fear alone, and found himself, more with each passing day, grateful in a way that went far beyond political convenience for the fragile trust she had chosen, against every reason she might have had to refuse it, to extend toward him. "You never answered my question," he said one evening, months after the confrontation at Ashwood, the two of them standing together on the same castle balcony, where he had once watched her from a distance, without the courage to speak her name aloud. "Whether you had decided, finally, what to do with the throne this bloodline offers you." Elira considered the question for a long moment, watching the moon rise pale and full over a kingdom that had begun, slowly, cautiously, to heal from generations of division. "I have decided," she said finally, "that I do not want a throne built on what my bloodline commands alone. I want one built on what I choose to build, deliberately, with people I trust to stand beside me, rather than beneath me." She turned to face him fully, searching his face for the same honesty she had watched him prove, patiently, consistently, in the months since his humbled arrival at Ashwood's Edge. "I have watched you earn back, slowly, what your pride once so carelessly threw away, Draven Voss. I am not offering you a crown, because the old laws demand it. I am offering you a partnership, because I have finally come to believe you are a man worth building one beside." Draven's expression, when she finished speaking, held none of the guarded pride that had once defined him in that great hall, on the night he had called her weak in front of an entire court. What remained instead was something far more honest, something that looked, unmistakably, like a man who understood exactly how much he had nearly lost, and exactly how much he intended never to take for granted again. "Then I accept," he said quietly, not as a king claiming what treaty or bloodline might grant him, but as a man grateful beyond words that the woman he once shamed found it in herself to offer a second chance he did not deserve. Beyond the castle walls, across a kingdom slowly learning to set aside 1,000 years of fractured pride, Packs that had once fought bitterly over scraps of contested territory began, cautiously, to speak instead of unity, drawn together not by fear of a conquering queen, but by hope for something better than the endless cycle of division their ancestors had bled for. Alira Hastings, once dismissed in a single cruel night as nothing more than a weak and unworthy treaty bride, stood at last as the lost queen fully returned, not through conquest, not through inherited command alone, but through the quiet, unbreakable strength that had carried her through every humiliation, every danger, and every hard, deliberate choice that had finally, completely, become entirely her own. And beneath a full moon rising over a kingdom beginning, for the first time in 1,000 years, to remember what it meant to stand together rather than apart, the lost queen of all wolves finally, fully came home.